Welcome to this evening's lecture, and we're very honored to have Dr. Phillip Johnson here to lecture this evening. My name is Bill Reimer, and I work here at the college. Dr. Johnson is the Jefferson E. Peiser Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley, where he has taught since 1968. Dr. Johnson is a graduate of Harvard University and the University of Chicago. He was law clerk for Chief Justice Earl Warren during the 1960s for a couple of years. And he has written 2 books published by InterVarsity Press entitled Darwin on Trial and Reason in the Balance. He writes regularly for periodicals like First Things and Books and Culture. He is widely read in science and contemporary culture. Last week, the New York Review of Books arrived in our bookstore, and I made a mental note of showing him an article by a University of Chicago scientist in it, and I thought he might be interested in. And lo and behold, I find out today that he's already read the article and written a response to it. So that gives you an idea of how he tries to keep up with current thinking. We're pleased to have you here tonight, and welcome. The format for this evening's lecture will be first the lecture, and then we'll have a time of question and answer. So, thanks.
Well, it certainly is a pleasure to be here in Vancouver for the first time and seeing an institution I've heard about for years, Regent College, but had never had the opportunity to visit before, and it's certainly a lovely place. An invitation in the summertime would have been even more welcome, but we're pleased with the bright sunshine and went for a walk in the botanical garden in the middle of the winter. It was really, I recommend it. It's really rather interesting way to see it. I call my lecture tonight the Inherit the Wind Syndrome, largely because when I was asked to give a title, I was working on a chapter of my new book with that title. And so I thought I would make that the takeoff point for this lecture. The new book is finished now, and it's at the press. The press just sent me an email saying that it was accepted and on the way to publication. So it'll be called Defeating Darwinism by Opening Minds, and will be published in time for the Christian Booksellers Association convention this summer. That was why there was something of a rush to complete it. And this is a book which is, my previous books have really been intended for a university audience, and I've had a lot of people say that they really want something that is suitable for, let's say, bright high school seniors, college freshmen, their moms and dads, and their teachers. And that's a level at which I find it's really interesting to approach this whole evolution and creation thing, because it's a marvelous way of telling a story, of bringing together the elements of drama and narrative in the scientific understanding of the world, and in teaching critical thinking, teaching people how to examine claims and decide whether they're valid or not, learn how to think properly for themselves. And that's why the title, is Defeating Darwinism by Opening Minds. The emphasis really is on the second part. And if one can't defeat it by opening minds, then one shouldn't be able to defeat it at all. But I'm convinced that, in fact, that is what is going to happen. And we're going to have a tremendous change in the intellectual climate of the 21st century from what we've seen in the 20th. Now, I'll begin to explain how that is, to give you the storyline, to tell you how I've seen things developing, by starting with the real trial that was the model for the play and movie Inherit the Wind. The play was written in the 1950s. The movie version, which my class just watched this afternoon, Stanley Kramer movie starring Spencer Tracy, was done in 1960. And the trial was in the 1920s, in the mid-1920s, the Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee. Now, what actually happened in the Scopes trial and aftermath is this. The Tennessee legislature passed a new education code, new education curriculum with a greatly enhanced science component. It was felt necessary to reassure the people that this science education was not going to be used to undermine their religion. And so a measure was put into the bill saying that it would be an offense to teach evolution. See, they were going to leave that out. But the legislative leaders and the governor agreed that this provision would never be enforced. It was intended explicitly at the start on the record to be a symbolic measure, and that no prosecutions would ever be brought. Nonetheless, the act got some publicity around, and the American Civil Liberties Union and its director, Roger Baldwin, decided that they wanted to make a test case. They were looking for an opportunity to test the laws and cultural prejudice against the theory of evolution. So they advertised for a teacher willing to be a defendant in a prosecution. Some business people in Dayton, Tennessee read the ad and decided that this would be a good opportunity to put their city on the map by having a well-publicized prosecution. So they looked around for a local person who was willing to be a defendant, found a man named Scopes, who had been a physical education teacher and who had briefly taught biology for a couple of weeks and couldn't remember whether he had taught evolution or not, but it was mentioned in the book he'd used. So he agreed to say that he had taught it, and the local prosecutor agreed to prosecute him. The ACLU offered to pay the expenses of the prosecution, since it was basically their show, but the town refused, and so they had this, what was intended to be a mock trial from the start. You see, it was something like a Chautauqua they had at that time. It was going to be an occasion for a public debate about it that would bring people into the town. Now, things got out of hand, and it became our first media circus trial when three-time presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan volunteered to prosecute. Bryan, at this time, was at the twilight of his career. He had been a progressive politician all of his life, what we'd call a liberal Democrat today. Was a liberal Democrat even then, I guess. He had been Secretary of State in Woodrow Wilson's government, had resigned because of the war policy, and he was a friend of the working man, friend of the farmer, enemy of big business, and so on, friend of the labor union sort of politician, and also very devout Christian of a fundamentalist variety. And he had become completely soured on Darwinism because he had seen it in its social Darwinian guise as the justification for robber baron capitalism and German militarism, the militarism that led to World War I that he had seen. And so he opposed it, essentially on grounds very similar to the opposition that left-wing professors like Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin at Harvard oppose social Darwinism today. All of the science was very, very different. The motivation wasn't tremendously different. He saw it as a pernicious kind of dog-eat-dog ideology. And he was leading a campaign against the Darwinian theory around the country, giving speeches, and so he agreed to prosecute. Well, that meant that the other side wanted to get a big name, and they went looking for the Johnny Cochran of the day, if those of you that know the O.J. trial, who was Clarence Darrow, a radical lawyer who is, you see, also on the left politically, but much more hard-edged kind of way than Bryan, named Clarence Darrow, who was fresh from his defense of Loeb and Leopold in the great thrill-killing case of the 1920s. So this then, you see, made it really a big show, and things got out of hand. The media came. Bryan was humiliated in the debate, but Scopes was convicted and ordered to pay a nominal $100 fine, which he never paid because the state Supreme Court dutifully reversed the conviction on a technicality having nothing to do with the Constitution, the truth of the theory of evolution, or anything else. So that was the events of the actual trial. Now, after that, what happened is that for some time, for decades really, there wasn't much of a controversy remaining over evolution, because it was understood throughout the United States that control of the school curriculum was in local hands, and that they could teach or not teach what they wanted, and nobody really challenged that until after World War II. And the publishers of the textbooks generally tended to stay away from the topic because they wanted a book that would sell in every district. That's how you make money in textbook publishing. So it was pretty much, even when I went to school in the early 1950s, I was in high school, mid-1950s, I remember that the book said, well, there's evolution and scientists believe in it, and now we'll go on to something else. So it wasn't much of a focal point of any kind of controversy. But then the Cold War, and specifically the Russian success with the Sputnik satellite, led the United States government to get tremendously enthusiastic about teaching science. Now, originally, at first this meant preparing professional scientists, so we could beat the Russians to the moon and so on. But increasingly it came to mean educating the whole public to have a scientific outlook, so that they would be supportive of science, in a democracy, and would look to science to solve their problems, would support it financially with their votes and so on, and would have this correct, scientifically oriented attitude. And that was when the government went into the business of producing textbooks and curriculum studies and so on, funded by the National Science Foundation, and marketing them to boards. They're really heavily subsidized products. And evolution began being taught as fact to the citizenry in general. And this is when you got the creation science reaction, and the biblical fundamentalists striking back with creation science. This time attempting being out of control, being out of government, and trying to get a foothold in the curriculum. Their campaign was to have balanced treatment or equal time for their creation science, Bible-based, and the official evolutionary science, and they lost that battle in the courts in a couple of famous legal decisions. So that is what sort of happened leading up to the 1980s, is that the government position then seemed to have triumphed. Evolution was being taught everywhere. It was being taught as fact. The creationists were not allowed to answer back. They were told, no, what you want to do is not within science, and you can't bring it into the schools at all. And what evolution came to mean and came to be understood as meaning is, I think, now very important to understand. Evolution, as science educators use the term, and as the scientific culture understands it, is not simply a process which is of long duration, longer than than 10,000 years allowed for by the biblical genealogies literally interpreted. It isn't just that it's of long duration. It isn't just that it's gradual. It's that it's materialistic, naturalistic, purposeless, and unguided. That is inherent in the meaning of evolution as it is taught in the science curriculum. For example, the National Association of Biology Teachers last year, 1995, passed an official statement defining evolution as it is taught in the school curricula across the country. And here are their precise words. As I say, this is an official statement, and it's also consistent with everything that's in all the textbooks. It's stated in a little different way here or there, but basically the same message is presented everywhere. And I quote, "The diversity of life on Earth, the diverse kinds of life on Earth, the diversity of life on Earth is the outcome of evolution, an unsupervised, impersonal, unpredictable, and natural process of temporal descent with genetic modification that is affected by natural selection, chance, historical contingencies, and changing environments." Now, what's left out of that? What is it not affected by? It's not affected by God. It's not affected by anything supernatural. It's not planned. It isn't God's way of creating. It isn't something that God used with the purpose of bringing about human beings. Let me read the key words again. Evolution, an unsupervised, impersonal, unpredictable, and natural process of temporal descent with modification. So you see, they say, and in context, it's quite clear what is meant by those words, is that it isn't God-guided, it isn't God-propelled, and it isn't planned to result in human beings. As George Gaylord Simpson, one of the founders of the modern theory of evolution, says in his book, The Meaning of Evolution, the meaning of evolution is that mankind is the result of a purposeless natural process that cares nothing about us. Human existence is an accident of a purposeless cosmos. Now, with that as the definition of evolution, you see, you can understand why it would be controversial in some areas, in areas beyond the strict biblical literalist or fundamentalist community. Because what that definition of evolution seems to be denying is not just that evolution was the relatively short duration process described in Genesis, but that it is not God-guided at all, that God is out of the picture altogether. Now, at the same time that the National Association of Biology Teachers says that, and again, I'm using this statement because it's official and so it's a useful thing to refer to, but there's nothing unusual about this. All the other books, and authorities say essentially the same thing. The statement says that evolutionary theory, and indeed all of science, is necessarily silent on religion, and neither refutes nor supports the existence of a deity. And indeed, at several other points in the statement, the statement says that we're not making any statement about religion. It says, for example, students can maintain their religious beliefs and learn the scientific foundations of evolution. And teachers should respect diverse beliefs, but contrasting science with religion, such as belief in creationism, is not a role of science. Science teachers can and often do hold devout religious beliefs, accept evolution as a valid scientific theory, and teach its mechanisms. Now, how do we put this together? We're not saying anything about religion or about God, and you can be devoutly religious, and this shouldn't bother you a bit. All we're saying is that you were created by a purposeless, unsupervised, unpredictable material process. See, that's the joint message. What's going on here? Well, now let me go back to the fictionalized version of the Scopes trial. Since I've titled this lecture, The Inherit the Wind Syndrome, I'd better say something about Inherit the Wind. Inherit the Wind is a very successful play, a very brilliant play, made into a very successful movie that gives the kind of Hollywood picture of what went on at the Scopes trial, and indeed has created a media stereotype about the whole controversy. In Inherit the Wind, the play begins when a posse of citizens invades a schoolroom where the teacher is teaching evolution. The teacher, Bert Cates, representing Scopes, arrests him and hauls him off to jail, and where he is locked up and facing years of imprisonment for this crime. He is in love, Bert is in love with Rachel Brown, who is, wouldn't you know it, the daughter of the leading fundamentalist minister who dominates the town, Reverend Jeremiah Brown. The Reverend Jeremiah Brown is a vicious, fanatical bigot with no redeeming qualities whatsoever. His theology is limited to cursing people and threatening them with damnation if they cross him in any way, and particularly if they think independently. Rachel herself is a conformist. She's in love with Bert, but she keeps telling him, you can't fight City Hall and you ought to give in because we've got to live in this community. Well, things get out of hand in this case. There's also, by the way, an element of history in that in the movie, the leading citizens do get together and they think this prosecution can be used to help the town when they learn that Matthew Harrison Brady, a former presidential candidate, obviously very closely modeled on William Jennings Bryan, will come as volunteered to assist the prosecution, to be the prosecutor. And they give him a hero's welcome. When Brady arrives, you see that he is a pompous fool, way past his best years, and a sneaky character who gets the confidence of Rachel Brown so that he can find out secrets about Bert, so that he can call her to the stand and use them against him. So you can see that the two, the Reverend Jeremiah Brown and the visiting dignitary Matthew Harrison Brady are both thoroughly despicable characters and fools. Now, in the play, then a character arrives, played by the actor Gene Kelly, famous as the dancer, but not dancing in this movie. E.K. Hornbeck, who is modeled on the journalist H.L. Mencken, a skeptical, agnostic, very ill-natured journalist, who was in fact more responsible than anyone for publicizing the Scopes trial as a great victory for evolution and against the bourgeoisie, as he called the citizens of his country. And so Gene Kelly playing Hornbeck is kind of like the Greek drama in this. He's always commenting on and making witticisms. And indeed, the defense lawyer then arrives, paid for by the newspaper, who is Henry Drummond, Clarence Darrow. So it's great. It's very literally modeled on the historical characters. And then as we see this develop, the townspeople give Hornbeck, the journalist, and Drummond, the wise defense attorney, the Socrates kind of character, many opportunities to exercise their wit, because every joke they make hits home. And every feeble attempt of Matthew Harrison Brady or somebody else to answer them just ends in embarrassment. It's a very one-sided sort of, play. Well, now, morally, the deck is stacked all in favor of the defense, of Bert Cates, the heroic teacher, the love interest, the defense attorney, the journalist. But legally, they haven't a leg to stand on. Because he did teach evolution. He was photographed in the act, and this is, constitutional decisions on this are way in the future. It's a local matter. And so there really is no hope for the defense. But in the end, as in the historical play, the defense attorney Drummond brilliantly saves the situation by calling his adversary Brady to the witness stand as an expert on the Bible. This testimony is completely irrelevant to the case. But Brady is so pompous, so conceited, that he insists on taking the stand to show that he can defeat Drummond. And Drummond skillfully takes advantage of his overconfidence. After a little preliminary sparring about Cain's wife and Jonah and the whale, Drummond stuns Brady by pointing out that the biblical patriarchs did their begatting by sexual intercourse. And in the play, in the script version, it seems this hits him like a thunderbolt. That sex is involved, whereupon he blurts out that the Bible calls sex original sin. Now, you see the importance of this. These people are against, lovemaking too, and are killjoys. And eventually, a rattled Brady concedes that since the first day of creation occurred before the sun existed, it might have been longer than 24 hours. Drummond seizes on this concession to demolish Brady's confidence and gets Brady to talk such obvious nonsense that even his supporters laugh at him. And so it all ends in a great moral victory for the defense. Bert is found guilty anyway because, the prejudice and the law and so on. But the town fathers are so embarrassed by the spectacle that they get the judge to give him only a modest fine, which he refuses to pay. Rachel Brown announces she is leaving her father. She is now going to think for herself, which means that she is going to accept Bert's opinions and go off with him. I've always, every time I watch this, I think, what's going to happen next? Is she going to start now thinking for herself against him? And will Bert Cates ever have second thoughts about having encouraged this development? But anyway, love and reason overcome prejudice and bigotry. Now, as the play ends, Drummond is left alone on the stage courtroom, and he walks up to the front. He sees a copy that had been used as exhibits of Darwin's Origin of Species and the Bible. He picks them up, hefts them in one hand, shrugs, and puts them together in his briefcase. See, the symbol here is that the Bible and the Origin of Species Bible and Darwin can get along together fine, provided Henry Drummond does the balancing. And that they're balanced by reason. You see, he's the Socrates figure, the reason. Now, there's a couple of other incidents, details in the play that I like to bring out that I think are very significant in understanding it. On the last day, after the humiliation of Brady in the cross-examination over the 24-hour days and the begatting, Brady comes to the courtroom hoping to save himself with a final speech, counting on his eloquence and lung power to bring things back his way. But present on that final day is a new factor called in the script of the play Microphone Man. Microphone Man shows up with, you guessed it, a microphone. It's the first radio broadcast, you see, and they're going to broadcast the final proceedings. And it turns out that Microphone Man is now going to control what everybody learns about the proceedings. Brady attempts to make a speech, and he finds that it doesn't work over the microphone. His platform manner, it's just embarrassing. It's a rant, and Microphone Man shuts him off and says, we're going back to station WGN for music. You see, so that you can see his day is over as the media have replaced the stump speaker of prodigious lung power who is able to communicate directly with the people that way. Now that's one of the events, is the entry of Microphone Man in. And the question is Microphone Man going to appear as a liberator or as a new oppressor? That's not raised by the play, but by the authors of the play, but I think it's inherent in the drama. The other thing that happens is that in the cross-examination, besides the stuff about Jonah and the whale and the 24-hour days, Drummond at one point accosts Brady on the free speech issue and on the everybody should be able to think for himself. That this is the message of the play. It's the independent mind, the thinker, the Bert Cates should be free of these dogmatists. And he says to Brady in this accusing voice, suppose Mr. Cates had enough influence and lung power to railroad through the state legislature a law that only Darwin should be taught in the schools. You see, and this is the decisive freedom of thought refutation of Brady. So we see in the play a picture, a story of how the evolution issue is argued, which says that the Christian ministers, at least of the fundamentalist sort, of the conservative sort that think that the Bible is a document with some historical validity, and they're the only kind that are in the play or the movie, are oppressors. You see, the independent mind rebels against them. It's helped by the wise people representing the intellectuals from the big cities, from Chicago, from New York, from Baltimore, who come into this town, and who help with the liberation. And this liberates the young people to get married and to make love. It liberates the young intellectual to think for himself. And it's a liberation story. It's like liberating Cinderella from the wicked stepmother and the wicked stepsisters. And it's a very significant story because it's still the way the press portrays every conflict that occurs, and they occur all the time over the country in local school boards and so on, over this issue. If a school board member says, I think we ought to allow the other side to be heard when evolution as defined by the National Association of Biology Teachers is taught, the newspaper reports will say, fundamentalists attempt to censor science education. Now, you see, the critics aren't in any position to censor anything. What they're trying to do is to get on the floor somehow to state their position in contrast to the official position. But they are reported as if we were going through Inherit the Wind again. This is these fundamentalist ministers who are trying to prevent people from learning about evolution. Now, they see themselves as trying to open up the topic. They see themselves as Bert Cates, you see, trying to challenge the official wisdom. But the newspapers and Microphone Man, see, the microphone owners, see the question as one of protecting the independence of the mind against these fundamentalists who want to shut down thinking. Well, this sort of takes us up in terms of the cultural view and the history up to the time that I got involved in this question in the late 1980s and in the period that led up to the writing of my first book on this subject, A Darwin on Trial. And I began the study of this issue and the writing of it as I got very interested in reading the literature of biological evolution by noticing a couple of really significant things, things that I felt had to be made the centerpiece of the public debate and the university level debate about biological evolution and its relationship to religion, philosophy, freedom, independence of thinking, and all of those other issues. Now, the first was that it seemed to me that to present this issue as an issue of Genesis literalism versus science was totally to misrepresent the core of what the problem was all about. The really important thing about the theory of evolution, as it's taught in the textbooks today, as it's presented as fact, unchallengeable, proven fact, is not that it challenges or refutes the Genesis chronology. It's not that it says the universe is billions of years old instead of thousands of years old. And it's not that it says that the creation process was gradual rather than sudden. Those might be important to people. I mean, I'm not saying that there's no importance to those issues. To some people, they're very important. But it's not what's centrally important. It's not what the issue is really fundamentally about. Because evolution, as defined in the textbooks and by the scientific community and by the Biology Teachers Association and all the other authorities, says much more than that. It says that we are created by a purposeless material process. And absolutely no doubt about that that is fundamental to the understanding of evolution that they have. And so in that case, it denies not just the early chapters of Genesis, but the entire Bible from the first to the last. In the beginning, God? No. In the beginning, matter. In the beginning, particles. In the beginning, impersonal natural laws. In the beginning was the Word? No. You see, that is contrary to the teaching of the evolutionary process of creation, which is an entirely materialistic process. Evolution, remember, is unsupervised, undirected, purposeless, unpredictable, whole string of words to get across that. And so it contradicts the beliefs of any person who sees God, a purposeful being, as our creator. No matter what, long, short, gradual, sudden, all of that's just detail. Did God bring about our existence one way or another for a purpose, or didn't he? Evolutionary biology says no. We are the unplanned products of a purposeless material system. Now, so it seems to me that that's really significant. Now, that being the significant thing about the theory, the significant scientific issue is the mechanism of evolution. That is to say, everyone who studies this acknowledges that biological organisms and systems are extremely complex. How did they get that way? They're more complex than a computer or a spaceship or, a wonder of modern technology. Richard Dawkins, the most famous popularizer of evolution in the world nowadays, says that they came about by the blind watchmaker mechanism, the accumulation of random small mutations through natural selection. Mutations are random. The selection just means that some things survive longer than others and leave more descendants than others. It's just that brute fact of differential success in reproduction and leaving descendants. And that's why it's all purposeless. And that mechanism is the key to the whole thing. It is the mechanism that gets the creator out of the picture by saying that you don't need a pre-existing intelligence to build biological organisms. We do need a pre-existing intelligence to build computers and spaceships and automobiles and so on. They're engineered, they're designed. But allegedly that's not necessary with biological organisms because they can be produced and were produced by this purposeless system of mutation and selection. Now, when I looked at the evidence for this, and I'm not really going to go into the evidentiary issues. If you want to know more about them, I'm sure the bookstore would be happy to sell you a copy of Darwin on Trial, where I go into them, at considerable length. When I looked at the evidence on the mechanism in particular, it was astonishing to me how weak it is, how practically non-existent. You have selective breeding of domestic animals like dogs, which is an intelligence-guided process and only produces limited changes within the species. You have trivial things like variations in size of finch beaks from one year to another, which are blown up as gigantically impressive proofs. But if you look at the evidence overall, it seemed to me it just doesn't fit this view of the tiny step-by-step accumulation of micromutations. And it's weak for a much more important reason than that I'm going to get to in a minute. But that was sort of where I started, with the appreciation of the weakness of the evidence. Now, if the evidence is weak, I haven't really attempted to prove that because it takes much too long to go into it. But if the evidence is weak, why are all the biologists so certain that the theory is true and that things happen that way? Well, the answer to that, it seemed to me clear, was that the reason is philosophical. The reason is that they're philosophical materialists. And they believe that science is based on a materialistic understanding of reality. In the beginning were the particles. In the beginning was the matter. Now, if we live in a godless universe, if there was only matter at the beginning, and matter had to, on its own, do its own creating, how did it happen? Well, something roughly like Darwinism has to be true as a matter of logic. You don't need any evidence. It follows directly from the philosophical starting point. Things must get started by chance. See, random activities, chance associations. Why? That's what's left when you've subtracted intelligence and purpose, you see. That would be God. So you have to start out with a purposeless, unintelligent universe, and that means chance. But you can't have only chance, because you have to get these very complex things that look so much. Richard Dawkins himself says biology is the study of extremely complex things that look as if they were designed by a creator for a purpose. So how do you explain that they really weren't? You see, you need a designer substitute, and that's this natural selection process, accumulation. And to show you how philosophical it is, Dawkins has a famous lecture, where he argues for universal Darwinism, which means that Darwinism would be true even on the other side of the universe. If life exists, Darwinism produced it. They say complex life does. Well, how does he know that? Obviously not through observation. It's because it's the only possibility when you start from a materialist starting point. Well, that explains why finchbeak variation and dog breeding can seem like powerful evidence for a purposeless material history of life to a scientific materialist who's a biologist. Because if something's just got to be true anyway, you're not very demanding about the evidence which is put forward to prove it. If I tell you that, if I dropped an apple this afternoon, and you know what? It fell down. It fell down, not up, but down. You're not going to be very demanding about the evidence I produce for that conclusion. If I tell you it fell up to the ceiling, you're going to look at it quite differently, say, because of the whole reality preconceptions that you bring to this. So as I got into the issue, it seemed to me very clear that what we were talking about here was a philosophical starting point. And of course, if you have a starting point in materialism, then you're going to come out with something very much like Darwinism. And in fact, modern Darwinism is a vast hodgepodge of conflicting and different and detailed ideas and so on. It's really just a label to put on whatever it is that's the most commonly accepted scientific explanation of the history of life, of the development of life in biology. And so it's true by philosophical definition. If you look at the same evidence the other way around and you say there may be a creator in the picture, then you're really impressed by the fact that the mechanism can't be demonstrated beyond the finchbeak level. and that all the major groups in life emerge all of a sudden in the fossil record, fully formed and not by gradual progressions and so on, and that was the basic difference. So I felt that I wanted to make this the central issue, to focus on the right issue, and to get away from that sterile Genesis chronology versus science debate, the one that's caricatured in Inherit the Wind. The second thing, so that I wanted to focus on the scientific and philosophical issues rather than the biblical one. Now, the second issue that I wanted to get into, and felt had to be brought out, is that there really is no such thing as theistic evolution. That people who think that they have accommodated science and religion by saying, well, I believe in God and I believe in evolution, and evolution is God's way of creating, are not understanding evolution the way the evolutionary scientists do. Is say, if you believe in God-guided evolution, where God actually does something, plans it, pushes it, programs it in advance, uses it to achieve a predetermined goal, you don't believe in evolution at all, even though it's gradual and step by step. What you believe in, I think, is better called soft-core creationism. You see, it's creation by steps and so on. But if it is planned, if the Creator does anything, then you will find that is just as unacceptable in science as the real thing of biblical creationism. My colleague Michael Behe has published a book which I highly recommend. It's also out in the bookstore, Darwin's Black Box, in which, as a distinguished molecular biologist, very much in the mainstream of science, he argues that the evidence of molecular biology shows design, that it shows structures which are irreducibly complex, which contain many different systems and parts which all have to be present to work together, and therefore cannot be built up step by step by the Darwinian kind of process. The reviews of his book in the major scientific journals have not taken issue with anything he says about science. They've said this is creationism. This is morally reprehensible. This cannot be allowed. So you see, Behe doesn't bring the Bible, the Genesis into it. He's a Roman Catholic, with this tradition of accepting philosophically evolution and so on. But because he is talking about an intelligence being necessary to do the designing, he is, in the views of the scientific, materialist, a creationist. So it's just as unacceptable as full-scale Genesis literalism from their point of view. So you see the problem this creates for anybody that says that they're a theistic evolutionist. And indeed, what the theistic evolutionists in Christian academia, who I've discussed this with and debated this issue with, tend to do is that at least when they're talking where the scientific community can hear, and where they're with the scientific audience, they do not dispute anything which the scientists say about evolution. They don't dispute. They don't say it's a guided process, a supervised process, a God-directed process. No, they say scientifically it's undirected. But we know by faith that God is behind it. You see, that as science proceeds on a materialistic basis, they will say, methodological materialism, methodological naturalism, even methodological atheism, we accept that, and so this is the evolutionary picture that science gives us. Now, theologically, we know it's God-guided, but there's nothing that's, evident in that. Nothing that you can see. And so this is the way in which the peace is kept between science and religion. Science describes reality, and we describe theology. And that, on those terms, the scientific world will tolerate the theism as harmless. Now, the problem is that this understanding of the process fits exactly within a scientific materialist notion of what religion is. Scientific materialists, or philosophical naturalists, and it's sort of another word for the same thing, believe in religion. It exists. They hold the view similar to that which H.L. Mencken, the journalist who covered the Scopes trial, memorably pronounced when he was asked if he believed in infant baptism. And he said, "Believe in it? I've seen it done." And in the same spirit, a scientific materialist believes in religion. I've met people like that. And religion is important. It has a role in, life, in social life, and so on. And so their understanding is that a theistic evolutionist is somebody for personal reasons of an emotional nature, or because they have to hold a job in a religious institution or whatever, wants to think about the process as, God's process in some sense or another, but that's purely subjective. That's something that's going on in their minds, not something that is real. And so they it's okay for them to think about it that way, provided that they don't take that fatal step of suggesting that God ever did anything. If they ever did anything that science has to take a note of, that's what's not allowed. So my goal has been to replace a sterile Bible science, fundamentalists versus scientists debate with what I see as the real debate. Are we here as the products of a purposeless material system, or aren't we? If the truth is that we're here as the products of a purposeless material system, then we ought to face up to it. Then I don't think I want to take refuge in a kind of I'll be religious anyway sort of a sense. I want my faith to be founded upon reality rather than on subjective imagination. When I grew up, I was ready to put aside the belief in Santa Claus when I found out it wasn't real. However comforting it might have been. Now, I don't see any reason why we should be afraid to face reality, because I'm also convinced that when we look at the evidence of science and at the evidence of biology impartially, when we look at it without the materialist bias, we will see that what is presented to the public as the absolutely certain neo-Darwinistic theory of evolution, this unsupervised, impersonal, undirected process, is way short in the evidence department. It isn't very well established by the evidence. But we'll see something more than that. You'll recall that a couple of minutes ago I said I was going to get to the most important reason why the Darwinian theory is inadequate, and it's not the problems with the fossil record or with extrapolating from finch-beak variation to how you get birds in the first place. Those are big problems. And they're the ones I started out with. But there's a bigger problem than that. An even bigger problem than that. And that is that the Darwinists, the scientific materialists, have not understood what needs to be explained. In fact, it's a very rare Darwinist. One thing I admire about Richard Dawkins is that he faces up to the problem honestly, which is very rare. He admits that biology is the study of very complex things that look as if they were designed by a creator for a purpose. This rarely comes up, in fact, in evolutionary debates, and I find most evolutionary biologists won't really even talk about it. They have traditionally seen the problem as accounting for variation. See, there are variations among things. You get little variations in the finch beaks and the dog breeding, so you could get bigger variations with a longer period of time, and then you got all the variation that's occurred. But that is not what needs to be accounted for. What needs to be accounted for is the complexity, the specified complexity, and the very high information content of the biological systems. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, I'll use an analogy which was actually employed by one of the leading evolutionary biologists, Darwinists and scientific materialists, George C. Williams, in some of his recent writing, without, I think, understanding how fatal his recognition is to the theory that he's espousing. Williams noted, as I think many of us have, that when we write, nowadays, we're used to writing on a computer, on a word processor. I do this. And I travel a lot, so I'll write and I'll save things, of course, to a disk. I'll print them out on paper. I'll send drafts over the internet to my friends and colleagues for criticism and advice. And in each one of these cases, we have the information in the chapter that I have written, which is the same information, whether it's printed out on paper, or whether it's on a silicon disk, or whether it's in some disembodied form going over the internet. In all of these different physical manifestations, it's the same information. Indeed, as an example I often use, it's the same information when it's recorded by some mysterious processes in our brains. If all the plays of Shakespeare were destroyed overnight, nothing of value would be lost, of permanent value, because the actors could reconstruct it with ease, who had memorized the roles. So information is something which is fundamentally different from the material medium in which it is encoded. And information comes in a lot of different types. The kind of information that we have in living organisms, like the kind that we have, let us say, in a very complex computer program, is information which is highly specified, must be of exactly a certain kind, extraordinarily detailed, and cannot be specified in advance by a formula. If, for example, again, the easiest thing for people to see this with is a book, because it's such a nice analogy and it really shows the same point. If you had a book that had only one word in it, say the word stuff, you could write a program which would say, just keep writing stuff until the printer runs out of paper. You see, and so a very simple program will program that book. That's like a snowflake or a crystal, you see, that has a certain information content. It's the same thing over and over again with an occasional typographical error. But if you have Hamlet, or even a humbler product like one of my books, you cannot specify it in advance by a formula. See, the formula would be almost as long as the book. And that is the minimal information content that has to be specified. Now, where does the information come from in the organisms that is the equivalent of the information content of a giant computer system, you know, or a spaceship or something? Where is the source of this information? Random mutation is not an information source. Try making random changes in your computer code, you see, and you do not change Microsoft Word into WordPerfect 6.1 by a series of random changes. What you do is you degrade the program until it goes out of business. Random mutation. Now the problem isn't solved by imagining that there are lots of tiny mutations instead of one big one. All Darwinists agree you can't get an organism with one jump of chance, because that would be a miracle. But if you have lots of tiny mutations, you pay the price that you have to have lots more of them, and of exactly the right kind when and if they come. Now, this is just an introduction to what I think is really the key issue, which is going to be taking central stage now in the information age. What is the source of the information? And many people in mainstream science are aware of the problem. That's why you're hearing so much about complex self-ordering systems. And somebody's going to ask me about this. I know, chaos theory, sort of, and all of this. All of these are hand-waving efforts, you see, to suggest a way that you can get the information out of nothing. In stating the issue that way, of course, I don't want to foreclose the possibility that some of these efforts might succeed. I don't believe they will, but that's for the free market in ideas to determine. The point is that it's a problem that has never really been understood in the Darwinian tradition and is now coming into the fore. Now, as this is happening, there's a tremendous resistance from the traditional science community, science education community, the journalists and so on, who are trying to impose the inherit the wind stereotype on the continuing debate. And you can see why they're doing that. They know how to win that. I had a famous science writer of my acquaintance, Martin Gardner, many of you have heard of, wrote me a whole series of letters over months, pestering me with questions about what I thought about Noah's Ark, whether Adam had a navel, the laws of Leviticus, and so on. He wouldn't discuss the science at all. See, what he was looking for was something that he could use to ridicule and to put me in the camp of Matthew Harrison Brady and the Reverend Jeremiah Brown. They want to talk about Noah's Ark. They know how to win an argument about Noah's Ark. They want to talk about the age of the earth. They don't want to talk about how you get all of this enormous specified information by a process that doesn't produce any of it. They don't want to talk about how what the evidence really is that this accumulation of mutations through natural selection can do the job of creation. So one of the big problems has been to break through the inherit the win stereotype and to achieve the goals that I have had, which from the start have been to legitimate the critique of Darwinism and scientific materialism in the secular academic community, first, and second, to provide the Christian community with a better approach to the issue, an approach which would not be so divisive, which would not divide the Christian community into theistic evolutionists who've accommodated with naturalism and biblical fundamentalists who have basically taken themselves out of the mainstream discourse altogether, but would give a viable, centralizing intellectual principle to put forth as the centerpiece for debate. Do we need a creator or don't we? Is God real? And that's why I've called the position I've staked out theistic realism. Yes, the creator is real. The creator really exists, and the creator really created, and the creator is really necessary. We can't account for creation without the creator. Now, the people of God will have many things to disagree with, but by definition, they should all agree on that. And so I've wanted to make that the centerpiece, of the argument with the materialist to create a viable debate and to replace a sterile and bankrupt one. Well, how's it going? Actually, it's going extremely well. The theistic realist position was recently discussed at a conference at Biola University. We had some 200 people come, 150 of them professors of science or philosophy from all around the world, largely but not exclusively Christians, to work on and develop the intellectual agenda. Some of you may have seen that written about recently in World magazine. They'll be writing a lot more. Christianity Today is planning a cover story on me to go into the background of all of this. We have a great deal of support from the major popular leaders of Christianity and the religious side of this issue, and a certain amount of controversial non-support from some of the people in academic Christian institutions who feel that this taking on the scientific culture on its own territory and so on is either unnecessary or unwise or both. But basically, I would say that very, very great strides have been made in the direction of establishing this as the central organizing principle of the debate on the religion side. On the secular side, a great many things have been happening as well. Next month, I'm going to be speaking at a conference at the University of Texas. Austin has been organized around this. Distinguished professors and a number of different views on it. Recently, I was invited by the public television networks of the United States, their Nova series, which is very pro-scientific materialist, to debate one of their stars on the internet, not on the program yet. That'll come next, but at their internet site, and we had a public one. The Boston Review, an intellectual publication, left-wing and materialist, published out of MIT, of all places, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, is devoting an issue to a forum on this with Michael Behe and myself and some of the others on our side, with some of the major heavyweights and the evolutionary materialist side. And gradually, we are getting this established, this challenge to materialism as an issue in the secular world. My feeling has been getting established as an issue is the whole ball game, the whole problem. Once the issue is established, Darwinism will collapse as an overall explanation for the history of life because they don't have an answer to it. And that's why they have to fight so hard to keep materialism the monopoly of the public intellectual arena and to keep the challenge off. I believe that the 21st century intellectually is going to be enormously different from the 20th century. The 20th century was the century of scientific materialism. Nietzsche, Marx, Freud, and Darwin are the major defining figures. That century is nearing its end. Freud and Marx have lost all the scientific standing that they once had. Darwin remains, but under ferocious challenge and maintained largely today by the power of microphone man. The intellectual high ground has been lost, and I think that your children and grandchildren will see a very different kind of world when that materialist scientific theory is revealed as the inadequate explanation it's always been, and then we'll face new challenges. Well, that's my talk, and now I'd like to invite you for the rest of the time to ask questions about any aspect of this that you'd like. Yes. Oh. Step up to the microphone, sir. And
I'd like to also mention that there will be a tape available as lecture after.
I always appreciate the first questioner who breaks the ice, whatever direction, please.
Well, I'm not a Christian and I'm not a biologist. I'm kind of a scientist, and I have no axe to grind. As far as I'm concerned, everything you said up to the last 5 minutes made good sense to me, and it sounded very much to me like the more speculative cosmology or Darwinism. At the very end, you seem to indicate to me a whole change. You went from I think you're right where you want to make the debate, but you implied that you'd already decided which way the debate would go independently of the evidence. Then you lost me, because I have no idea whether it's going to be possible to prove one way or the other. But assuming it is, my experience with things that are more definite in science, which is easier, people that feel too tied up to the literal interpretation of the Bible, they'll change their ground. They'll present some theory, something wrong, and you can show them it's not right. And then that won't convince them. They'll go back and find another way of looking at it. Typically, there are people that attack relativity, which is well established.
Okay, well, I'm not talking about, people who base their arguments on Genesis or people who attack relativity. I'm making a prediction about what I see is going to happen, and, that I have reason to. But let it happen, however. You see, actually, I don't have any power to control the debate, obviously, nor do I wish to have any. Yeah, that's right, and that's fine. And you see, the thing that affects my judgment about this as much is that I have seen over the past years the ferocious fight that the Darwinist community and the scientific materialist community is fighting to keep the issue off the table.
Please turn the tape over now.
This is why they have to characterize Michael Behe as a Christian fundamentalist, a Genesis literalist in disguise, because they don't have an answer to the arguments on the biochemistry. Now, maybe they'll come up with one. You're quite right to say that should be maintained as a possibility. And my attitude is, if so, more power to them. I think we'd have begun to see it if they had it, but let's wait and let's see. Yes?
I think you do science a grave misjustice. I think with the series of misquotes and misrepresentations, and I'm not going into to go on very much, but it's based on a misunderstanding of science. I think the difficulty is that science is not claiming that there's a God outside this universe. And that's perhaps difficult for Christians, naturally. And we're talking about theistic and Richard Dawkins and so on. Other religions may not have the same difficulty as Christians have. And as a Christian,
do you have a question or a particular point?
I'm just saying that there's a series of misrepresentations and misquotes. We're not talking about evolution as a law. As you may know, it's simply a theory. Scientists don't claim to have all the answers to how evolution came to be.
All right, I understand you disagree with the whole lecture from beginning to end.
Birds' feet and so on, but, and are still misrepresenting and not acknowledging the recent discoveries.
Yes, well, you see, I find that I typically do get a response like this out of the scientific community. Because, in fact, it's the constant: I was misquoted, they were misquoted, this is all misrepresentation, and so on. And this is why, in my writings and in all of my books and articles, I find it necessary to use long paragraph-length quotes. If you get the books and so on, you'll see that. Because it is the only way to protect yourself against the constant denial that we ever said anything like that. They did say it all. And all of them said it again and again and again. And any attempt to back off and say, we're not talking about ultimate reality or so on, I would say, go back to the sources, see the quotes, they say it, and they mean it. Yes?
I noticed a few years ago that Scientific American published a speculation on the growth of crystals that were based on clay, saying that they could be a template for the primitive self-replicating behavior of RNA and DNA. What has come to light since then?
Yes, this is a subject which is covered to some degree in Chapter 8 of Darwin on Trial. And the theory to which you're referring to, I guess I have to give a little bit of a background to make it coherent exactly what it's about. In 1952, an experiment was done which gave, they called the Miller-Urey experiment, which gave a big boost for a time to the research into the chemical origin of the first living organism. This is pre-biological evolution. Before you get natural selection started, you have to have something living. So how do you get the first living thing? And that's chemical evolution or pre-biological evolution. And after the Miller-Urey experiment, they thought, well, we can get some of the chemicals, and pretty soon we'll show how chemical reactions do that. As the research ran into dead ends, some of the scientists in the field gave up on that whole approach. And one of them in particular, a Scottish chemist named Cairn Smith, developed a view. He said that there must have been a precursor, a form of life which is vanished totally, but existed first and that got all of this started. You see, and it's like an arch where you build all the supports and so on, then you take them away. This is often used as an analogy of it. And then you don't see them anymore, and you just see the stonework. But it wouldn't have been possible without all that scaffolding, you see. And so it's the clay here is the scaffolding. And he developed this scenario that maybe clays, or silicons of some kind that form crystals, could somehow have formed a non-organic, non-DNA based, non-organic kind of form of something like life that then got taken over by DNA. Now, nothing has ever come of this, is the short answer. It's a kind of a brilliant hypothesis, and people were interested. And the reason that they're interested is that all the other approaches seem, to be going nowhere. But this one is going nowhere either. And it's now a field. I have some really nice quotes from professional observers within the field who say all the experiments seem to end in futility. Now, you see, I would fit this within the same analysis I've given in general in the lecture, that the chemists like Cairn Smith and like the others and so on have not paid attention to what the real problem is, which is the minimal informational content of the cell. Where does that information come in? It isn't present in the chemicals or in the chemical laws. And so it's like trying to get a book by manipulating ink and paper. You see, you can't do it because you need the independent source of the information. That would be my opinion. Now, of course, once again, as for the first question, the field might prove otherwise and certainly might prove me wrong, but that's how I would say things stand for now. Yes, have another question over on this side. Were you waiting for a question? Because I'll get over there if you are, yeah.
I'm not a scientist, but I am a Christian. And I was brought up in a home and in a church where I was never allowed to ask questions. And I welcome the Darwin theory, and I welcome a lot of Freudian psychology because I think it has pushed us Christians to find out what we really believe in. And I don't think that we should be afraid of the questions or of actively seeking the answers.
I absolutely agree with that. And, of course, you see, that's why my new book is titled, Defeating Darwinism by Opening Minds. That what is mind-opening, in one generation may become the oppressor in the next. In fact, we see this very often. And, another part of your question that I really like and I really agree with, I come from outside the Christian world. I'm an adult convert from the secular world, and I have minimal experience personally with the Christian subculture and all. But I sure know that there must have been something fairly oppressive going on there because I meet so many people who, as adults, are revolting against the fundamentalist background. And you see how self-defeating that is. This is why a major part of my teaching is absolutely we must not be afraid of the questions. That trying to protect people from information, trying to protect them from the hard questions, and so on, particularly in this culture, it's futile. I mean, they'll get it later on anyway, but even if it worked, it would be unworthy. you see, and that we should confront that. And that's what I see myself and my group as doing with this scientific materialism. So I much agree with you in that approach. We have the next one. I'll get the lady on this side and then come back to you next. If you're up, he's not waiting for the mic.
It seems to me that you're saying because Christians have, in this play, been portrayed as bigots and narrow-minded and ignorant and just hypocritical generally, that therefore we need to kind of back away from using the Word of God as the means whereby we communicate truth to the world. Well, that has always happened. Like Christians, wherever people hate God, they will hate his people. But the Word of God says, the entrance of thy word gives light. The Apostle Paul says, I don't come to you with words of eloquence and the wisdom of man and so on. I come to you with Jesus Christ and him crucified. And while I appreciate very, very much that, guys like you are in the forefront showing us that Christianity is intellectually satisfying, it's worthy, and I agree with that lady, like we need never be afraid of the questions, and you certainly say that too. But where I'm uncomfortable is that you're saying, hey, let's just leave Genesis out of this and let's focus on the philosophical problem. I'll let you answer that.
Okay, yes, I'm very pleased to be asked that question too. That's a good, challenging one that really ought to be brought up. Now, the same thing isn't right for everybody in every situation. I think there are an awful lot of places where if you want to, talking to somebody about the Christian faith, about accepting Christ, you bring the Word of God to it. This is what is done in the prisons, and in the athletes' fellowship groups and so on, because that makes sense to them in that setting. Now, the world that I am dealing with is the world of Berkeley and Harvard and the University of Chicago, and then to some extent the seminaries and the Christian colleges and all that, the intellectual world. Now, if you come into that world, see, if I come into the world of Berkeley and say, I want to tell you about what the Bible says about the history of life, that is a non-starter. And in fact, you see what it does is it affirms their stereotype. You're going to talk to us about religion. We know about that. That's religion, and that's, in your heads. And whereas science gives us what is objective and valid for everybody. And you never get into the science and the philosophical assumptions and so on. Now, what I want to do is to show the intellectual world that they are making very controversial philosophical assumptions and disguising them to themselves, as well as to others, as fact, as scientifically observed facts. And, one might say destabilize, even deconstruct, if I may use a very dangerous term, that level of certainty. So this is the approach that is absolutely, necessary in meeting the powers of the secular world, in the academic and, journalistic world, sort of, and so on. But it's not necessarily right for all times and all purposes. Now, the next step in the answer to your question, which is also essential, is it's after somebody understands that materialism isn't the whole answer that they might be willing to listen to another source, you see, that it becomes a possible part of their mind picture. So you're very welcome. After I have made the inroads at Harvard and professors say, my gosh, we don't know anything, you are very welcome to go there with your Bible and take it from that point. That's another subject. We'll get into that sometime. But I'm inviting her to... do you want me to tell her she can't go to them with the Bible? Yeah. I think that they might want to listen to what the Bible says, yes, and that they might find a great deal more truth in it than they had thought. But I don't know how much or about what. Those are very hard questions for that, yes.
Yeah, you mentioned the Kolmogorov-Chaitin stuff on information theory and the problem that creates with Darwinism. Now, it's your claim, I think, that the probability of getting complexity out of one large mutation is approximately the same as accumulating it over a number of small mutations. Is this a mathematical intuition, or do you have some sort of proof? I really want to know, because
Yeah. Well, I believe it's mathematically sound, but I have to. I'm perfectly willing to admit that mathematics. He asks me. Someone wants the question repeated. I think is my statement that it's as hard to get the information out of small mutations, a lot of small mutations, as to one large one. Is that an intuition or is that mathematically supportable? I believe it's mathematically supportable, but I'm not probably the one to do it. That's not my a strong point. I would tend to rest on a fairly simple analogy. Your chances of winning the $10 million grand prize in the California State Lottery are vanishingly small, but it's been done. Nobody has ever won the $1 million prize 10 times, or the $100,000 prize 100 times. You see that. So now the logical point behind this is that you need all the same information. You don't reduce the information that's needed. And so if you say we're going to get it out of lots of small mutations instead of one large one, there is no logical reason to suppose that this is necessarily easier, or that it completely reduces the problem. Now, I'll leave it for there.
Yeah, it seems right intuitively, but
Mm-hmm. But you're not sure.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I think it's right for you not to be sure. I'm in the business of trying to pose the right questions and the challenging questions rather than to give the answers that sort of would nail it down. So if somebody wants to dispute that, and then we have the debate and so on, that's fine with me.
The issue that you brought up about where does the information arise from, it seems to me that where is if you posit a selection function, where is the selection function that's for information? It seems to me that actually arises from the nature of physical reality itself, in the sense, in the one example, if you have, for example, insects, there's an actual absolute physical scale. They can have an exoskeleton that's structurally strong enough to support it, but you can't scale up an insect to the size of a human being, because structurally it's not strong enough. You have to have skeletons, and elephants can't look like gazelles, and for example, in photo detection, say if you consider the evolution of the eye, you might start. This is the one where Dawkins, I believe, tries to give an example. You could start with the very simplest kind of photo detection, but then if you actually wanted to do contours and shading and be able to recognize a certain image from different angles, we know that you computationally, you have to have more computational power to do that. So those kinds of selection pressures are I would regard as imposed by the nature of physical reality.
Yes, there is a physical reality that imposes limitations, but what you're talking about is the limitations that are imposed by the nature of certain problems. You can't have something, an insect that gets bigger and bigger because it doesn't have enough, it won't work. And you can show that by the application of physical laws and so on. That is not explaining the source of the information that makes it work. This is like explaining that you can't get a book longer than 10,000 pages. That doesn't explain how you get Hamlet written. You see, that is the problem of the meaningful program which has to exist to make it work. So that's not really an answer. Now, on the vision thing, this, on this, the whole range of issues, I very much would urge people to read Michael Behe's book. He totally destroys the Dawkins argument about the eye, and the whole nature of that argument with respect to a number of complex systems. And the way he does it is that he says that these arguments all come out of 19th century understandings of what organisms are, which is that they're basically simple things. And that when you understand their surface features, the things you can observe in the eye, the lens and the parts and so on, you understand how it works. But this is false. They actually work at the biochemical level. They're vastly complex biochemical systems. And he said, when you talk about the proteins and the enzymes and so on, when you open, his book is titled Darwin's Black Box. When you open the black box and see the machinery within, then you see a whole entirely different level of complexity, of interrelated, irreducible complexity, where you need all the parts at once for anything to work. And he points out that biochemists don't even attempt in the professional peer-reviewed journals to present scenarios for all of that happening. So you're speaking about certain limiting factors and all, and what you say is no doubt true. But it doesn't explain the problem that needs to be explained to get the biological creation done. We have one on this side, yes.
Yes, I'm a research chemist, and I'm also a systems engineer. Would you be interested in a method of demonstrating that the probability of evolution occurring chemically is zero?
I mean, if the evolution of a living organism, or?
Mathematics is a precise science, and the term zero is a precise quantity. It can be demonstrated using 3D graphics that it is impossible to form proteins the way, proteins the way Darwin
Yeah. Oh, I would be interested, yes, but I actually prefer that you presented this to my colleague Behe rather than to me.
No, but it's for the audience really, because I'm substantiating your position.
Okay. I think it sounds to me like it's going to take too long and be too technical for this audience.
But I'm just telling you that it is possible to demonstrate that mathematically, right?
Okay.
The probability is actually zero, not some infinite.
Okay, well, I think, let's leave it with that assertion. That may well be the case. Fortunately, I don't need that. Because I'm dealing with a scientific community that says it's certain. Now, there's a long way, of course, between certain and zero. And substantial uncertainty is enough to carry my point. But I wouldn't necessarily dispute that you are right. But I'd rather not try to evaluate that or, have the audience do that here in this setting. Did we have another here? I don't see anybody on this side, so go ahead.
Mine's a three-tiered question, so just hold your patience a bit. You claim that methodological naturalism is inconsistent with theistic realism, is that correct?
Yes.
And so my question's kind of like this. If science is, though, solely the study of physical processes, how then would you propose that a theistic realist who happens to be a scientist by profession go about doing science? Are you proposing then in that he start positing non-material entities in a scientific pursuit? If this requires a redefinition of science altogether, what do you propose that redefinition would be?
Mm-hmm. What is the redefinition of science that I would propose if methodological naturalism is inconsistent with theistic realism? This is what we're talking about, like at the Biola conference, and all of that is exactly how best to address questions like that. Now, what I'd say for now about this is that the question is what's true and what isn't true. You see, either there are entities beyond science that have to be posited, or there aren't. Now, considering some of the things that physicists posit, in the particles and in inflation theory and so on, it isn't too much or too extravagant to imagine that there are things beyond the capacity of science to study that may necessarily exist to account for the things that they can study. Now, the particular aspect of that I'm interested in, that I got started with this is can you account for life without imagining, a source of information, a source of intelligence, because the material processes alone can produce it. Now, what I really want to do is just to ask that question and face it, and let's answer it honestly. The scientific materialists have assumed the answer to that. That they use the reason why methodological naturalism is so distorting. Is that it isn't recognized as a limitation on science, it's a limitation on reality. Reality must be of such a nature that we can explain everything in naturalistic terms, and so there must be a blind watchmaker mechanism, and the only question is figuring out the details. Now, I believe that that's been distorting. And so what we should be asking is, can you really explain things that way? Now, if somebody wants to say, yes, I can, and I've got this experimental evidence, and I think I can establish that, that's fine, and they're part of the dialogue, and they're part of the debate. What I want to get rid of is this assumption that it's true by definition, and to make it a matter of examination. Now, let us suppose that Behe and I win the argument, on this, that nobody's able to come up with the detailed theory and so on. Then what happens? Well, then it's just, you've got another basic thing to start with. Science always starts with certain things already in existence, the laws and so on, the constants, and then they try to make that as simple as possible to get it down. But there are some things you just have to take as a given. One of our number, Hubert Yockey, a very mainstream, a theoretical biochemist, his book is published by Cambridge University Press and all of that. He says information's just a given. You just have to start with it. It can't be produced by the laws of physics and chemistry or chemistry reactions. The probability is zero, or sort of something like that. And Yockey says, and he's the guy who can do the math and the calculations and so on. And he says you just start with information. Now Yockey is not a Christian, or a theist of any kind, sort of, or whatever. He just says that's the way the world is. You see, and everybody else would have that option too. It doesn't force them into any kind of theological belief. It's just recognizing reality if it's true. So my desire to get away from methodological materialism or naturalism is not at all a desire to have scientists say, well, we won't do experiments anymore, we'll just attribute everything to the miracles or whatever. It's to open up questions that have been closed down by the dogmatic assumptions. The business of science will still be to do experiments and to evaluate their outcome and so on. But they may have to take account of some rather, immaterial or unstudyable entities in order to make sense of it. And after quantum physics, why should anybody regard that as unacceptable? It's a mysterious world. Yes, I think we're about at the last question here. It's the witching hour. So we'll take one final question from this distinguished appearing gentleman.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson, I'm with you in what you're saying. Seems to me, though, and you may be able to help me in this, that you are conducting your debate from a view of early Genesis and other parts of the Bible, which you've arrived at and I've arrived at and others have arrived at, which is a particular way, which is, I think, a correct way of reading, say, Genesis 1 and the Noah story and other matters. But it occurs to me that some of those folks that write to you and pester you and want to sort of manoeuvre you into a stereotyped position of a fundamentalist so that they can deal with you, I just have some concern for them, because they may well have arisen out of the kind of bigoted world of church life that some of us know about. And whereas you're conducting your debate, as it were, from the point of view of a particular theological synthesis, which I think is right, and which I agree with, but others who haven't arrived at that position don't. And so as far as they're concerned, the debate really is about what Inherit the Wind was about. Mm-hmm. Whereas you're conducting it from another point of view, and I just wonder whether people in question are on all fours in this matter.
Well, that is a very good question to finish with, and a very intelligent one. I sort of rephrase it for the audience. I think understand what you're getting at, that there are a lot of people out there who belong in the Inherit the Wind stereotype, as a sense, that they are Bible thumpers and are wanting to impose their view and sort of and so on. And how does that fit in with what I'm doing? Now, I in some ways, although I'm fighting the triumph of Darwinism and scientific materialism and all of that, I'm not sure that I regard its temporary ascendancy as a bad thing. Certainly not a bad thing altogether. As some of the questioners here, and as I often get questions out of a Christian audience, sort of in particular, it'll sort of say, well, we have recognized, that in some cases the enemy is us. And that world that was overthrown by the 20th century materialism and so on, it was there were a lot of things that deserved overthrowing. And the notion of bigoted, fundamentalist parents and, oppressive and religious environments and so on is by no means entirely fictional. And so we should not assume that if we overthrow a materialist, oppressive, kind of situation, that we replace it with the New Jerusalem, in which the lion lays down with the lamb and there's peace and joy. Nor should we doubt for a moment that our own side has all of this capacity for, using strong-arm tactics and moral browbeating and dogmatism and even worse things than that, that the other side does. I am theologically very comfortable with that realization. This is a problem that you've all heard of. It's called sin. You say, and it's omnipresent. As Solzhenitsyn said, it goes right down the middle of every human being. It doesn't divide people into one camp or another. What we've learned from the post-Inherit the Wind developments, you see, is that the scientific elite, the cultural elite, the New York Review of Books elite can act just as dogmatically and, as oppressively as the people that they fought, you see, originally. They should learn that about themselves, and we should learn that about ourselves. That the world isn't divided between people who belong to a party of good people, and against a party of bad people. Though it's very good that we recognize that. That's why I so appreciate this kind of question. Now, another thing I want to say, however, before finishing on that topic, is that the way to get people out of a rigid position like that is, in a sense, in a way, to empower them. Not to empower them, of course, to oppress others. But what I mean is to give them the power of the mind, the power of asking questions, the power of meeting them.